find it. So.
No.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. Happy Thursday. We hope everybody's having a great day. It's a strange weather day. You don't know if it's going to rain, whether it's going to be sunny. I don't know.
Right.
But thanks so much for coming out today. I'm going to turn it over to Beth, and she's going to introduce our guest today.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. We're glad that everybody joined us this afternoon. So we have a hot topic today, hot topic, and around transition and what's happening in the world of transition to adult life, transition planning, and what's going on with all of the information and guidance around during this time of COVID and shutdowns and end of the school year and all of the things that are happening. So we invited Attorney Christina Ghio to come on today and talk with us about what is happening. So welcome, Christina. There you go.
I just unmuted. Thank you.
So you're muted. My friend has this little sign that she holds up now, and it says you're muted. She has like all these like Zoom signs. They're so great. I'm like, I need some of those. So welcome, Christina. We're really glad to have you here to talk about transition. And Christina is a special education attorney representing. Is all of your practice students?
Mostly. I mostly do special education, but I also handle DCF cases, so child welfare cases. Generally, that's representing parents and some DDS eligibility and things like that. But most of what I do is special education.
Great. So I'm going to turn it over to Christina. So thank you so much for being here with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you everyone for joining the call. I normally do a transition presentation that's like an hour and a half to 2 hours. So what I've done is kind of consolidated things, and then I want to focus on some of the things that are happening right now, and in particular with regard to COVID. And also, some of you may have heard there's an important new federal court decision, so we can talk a little bit about that. Part of what I was going to do is pretty basic. So if people can just tell me, maybe just raise your hand if you already know the basics of transition and that is not going to be useful to you.
So you can either physically raise your hand, or there's a little reactions box at the bottom of the screen. So you could actually click on reactions and you could, thumbs up.
So I'm thinking thumbs up is just like waving, like I already know the basics.
Yes.
Right?
Okay.
So I'm what I see on my screen is there are kind of 6 people participating, and I think 4 of them said, yeah, I already know that. So for the other 2, I just want to check in. Would it be helpful for me to briefly go through what are the basics of transition planning? Like, what does transition services mean, and how does that process work? If you can use the thumbs up, would be good. Yes. Okay.
Yes.
So it's always welcome. Right. And some people don't have any experience. So
yeah. So for those of you who clearly know it, bear with us. I'm going to go pretty quickly through just the basics so that people have that framework and understand what we're talking about when we talk about transition. So, the first thing is transition services. I always start with, this is something defined in the federal law, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and in particular in the regulations. And I think the definition is really important because it kind of helps you understand the depth and breadth of what we're talking about when we talk about transition services. So I'm going to kind of read the definition because I think that's important, and then we'll move on from there. So it is a coordinated set of activities, right, for a child with a disability. It is designed to be within a results-oriented process, right? Very important. We're talking about results here. It's focused on improving the academic and functional achievement of the child with a disability to facilitate the child's movement from school to post-school activities, including post-secondary education, vocational education, integrated employment, including supported employment, continued and adult education, adult services, independent living, community participation. So all of those pieces are subparts to what we talk about when we talk about transition, and they all come from the federal law. Definition goes on. It's based on the individual child's needs, as is everything in special education, right? Everything is based on assessment of the child's needs, taking into account the strengths, preferences, and interests of the child. It includes instruction, related services, community experience, the development of employment and other post-school adult living objectives, and acquisition of daily living skills, and provision of a functional vocational evaluation. There's more to the definition, but I think that really kind of helps people understand that we're talking about something that's pretty broad in scope and also pretty deep. And we should always keep that in mind, you know, when you're going to your school district to talk about the need for transition. And, you know, it's not just about did the child obtain enough credits in high school to move on. It's much, much bigger than that. Okay, so basic requirements. Number one, every child is supposed to have a transition plan. This should be developed as part of the PPT process. So you're used to going to your PPT meetings. The topic of transition should be discussed and should be planned for in the IEP that is going to be in place when the child turns 16, okay? If we're talking about a child who's on the autism spectrum, then that goes back to age 14. So they're supposed to start transition planning at the age of 14. And so that annual review meeting before the age of 14 or 16, depending on the child's needs, and the triennial before that, we should be talking about, well, what evaluations are we going to do? How are we going to assess independent living skills? How are we going to assess this child's ability to participate in the community? How are we going to assess this child's ability to work? So that should start happening again. If the child's on autism spectrum, that has to happen with the IEP that's in place when the child turns 14. And for all other kids, it's the age of 16. As I said earlier, transition is always, you know, like everything in special education, is based on evaluation. So you want to get good, solid evaluation. So I always tell people, IEE if you disagree. So if the district does a transition evaluation, that is an evaluation. You have a right to an independent educational evaluation. So you have the right to say, you know, I don't agree with this transition evaluation that you've completed, and I want to go get an independent one. And the same rules apply as when you ask for any other independent educational evaluation. They either say yes, they have to pay for it, and you are entitled to select the evaluator as long as they have appropriate qualifications. Or if they're going to say no, they have to file a request for a hearing with the state education agency, right? So with the State Department of Ed, they have to ask for an administrative hearing. So I'm not going to go more into detail on IEEs because we do have a certain amount of time here, and I want to get to some of these really important things that have come up recently. So the other thing that I'm just going to say in terms of that general transition is essentially it works like this. You get your evaluation, get a good solid evaluation. It identifies the child's needs. And then from that, you, number one, identify what the post-school outcome goals are, right? Does this child want to go to a four-year college? What does this child want to do for employment? There's a page in the IEP that's specific to that. That should be based on assessment, not somebody just makes it up. So the post-school outcome goals are supposed to be created. Then we create goals and objectives. Okay, if this child wants to go to a four-year college, what are the skills that the child still does not have, but will need in order to transition to college? Let's build those into the IEP. Those should be goals and objectives. Just like all your other goals and objectives, they should be measurable and attainable, right? And the service hours and what services are provided should be based on what those goals and objectives are, okay? There is a document from the State Department of Ed that is Connecticut Core Transition Skills. So if it's not something you're familiar with, you should look at it because it outlines what the transition skills are. And there are a couple that I think are important. And one of the reasons I think they're important is because of the verb. So for example, demonstrate and accept responsibility for independence and activities of daily living. That doesn't say practice. That doesn't say get exposure to. It says demonstrate the skill. And so I think, and there are a number of those. So demonstrate appropriate social interaction and skills is one, right? Demonstrate skills to access appropriate employment. So when we're talking about transition and goals and objectives, we shouldn't have goals and objectives really that say we're going to practice this thing or we're going to have exposure to this thing. It really should be this child is going to demonstrate the ability to do X, and it should be measurable. So I think it's good to look at the core transition skills. There's another document that I think is helpful for parents, and I say that with a caveat, and I'll explain what that is. So there is a topic brief that was put out by the State Department of Education in like 2007. And it's a topic brief on writing transition goals and objectives. So I think it is useful in a couple of ways. I think it's useful for parents to go through and sort of think about, well, which of these things do I think my child really needs to work on? What's relevant, what's not relevant? And then the second way that I think they're useful is sometimes I hear that a school will say, oh no, we don't do community participation, for example. That's not an educational thing. Well, it's in the list of, you know, sample goals and objectives from the State Department of Education. It's sometimes helpful for a parent to have it at an IEP and say, well, I see it here, seems to me it would be appropriate. The way that I think it's less helpful is a lot of the goals are not particularly measurable. There are words like practice, which from my perspective, I think are not really appropriate. I think we really need to be talking about development of skills. But again, it does have a purpose, I think, for parents who are trying to figure out what the possibilities are, what kinds of skills we can be talking about when we talk about transition. Okay. The other thing I just want to say is there are some children who need transition-only services. So these are kids who maybe have an above average IQ, they're able to do their academic work, they obtain their credits in high school, but you know, sometimes we see this for kids who are on the autism spectrum, their social skills still need a lot of work, their independent living skills still need a lot of work, employability skills. And so they may have reached, you know, attained all of their credits where technically they could get a diploma, but they don't have the skills that they need to transition to independent living, employment, and post-secondary education. And so those kids may have a transition services only IEP, it's fine for them to do that. It's totally appropriate. Your child is not absolutely required to graduate just because they've met the academic requirements if they are not in fact prepared to transition to post-secondary education, employment, and independent living. So I think that's important. I want to touch for a moment on graduation. If kids are going on to receive transition services, they still may choose to graduate, you know, not this year, but walk across the stage, right? In a normal year, they get to walk across the stage with their graduating class. This year, you know, they should participate in whatever the school is doing that year. If it is the drive-in movie theater kind of thing, that seems to be a big thing, then they should participate the same way the other kids are participating in that ceremony. Okay, so I'm going to move on to some of the COVID related issues and the federal court case. So let's start.
Christina, I'm going to pause you just for
Yeah.
1 sec. So I put the Connecticut Core Transition Skills and the topic brief links into the chat. and I'll put the other documents as you talk about them. There's two questions just before we move on to the next section. People are asking why autism at 14 and not other disabilities?
The legal answer to that is because there was a change in our state law to require it. I think that the sort of practical answer is that often kids on the autism spectrum have require a longer period of transition. The other thing I should say in regard to that, which is important, is if your child is not on the autism spectrum, but you think you need to start at 14, you can ask the school to start earlier because the law allows transition planning to start earlier. So for any parent, I mean, frankly, I think the minute you walk into high school, we should be talking about transition, right? For a typically developing kid, we go to the guidance, we start talking about what's your plan, do you want to go to college? Okay, let's think about what classes we're supposed to take. All students, everybody has a student success plan, which lots of parents never see and don't know exists. So ask for the student success plan. You know, that's a regular ed document every kid should have, but it can start earlier. You have to make a request. You say, you know what, I'd like a transition evaluation in freshman year of high school, and I'd like to start planning for transition right now. There's absolutely no reason you can't request it earlier, even earlier than 14. And was there a second question? Okay. All right, so let's talk about a recent development that is a pretty big thing. The Disability Rights Center, which is Connecticut's parent advocacy center for people with disabilities, it's a federally required agency, sued the state of Connecticut and said essentially that our state law was not legal. It did not meet the federal legal requirements for special education. And so the state law currently on the books says you are entitled to educational services until the end of the school year in which the student turns 21, right? So if you turn 21 in May, you get services until June of that year, and then you're done, okay? What this lawsuit did is essentially, I'm not going to get into the details of the legal argument, but they said, no, that's not what IDEA, our federal law, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, that's not what the law says. That law says you get it until you turn 22. And so the court agreed, and the court has said that Connecticut's statute is a violation of IDEA, and Connecticut is required to allow children to continue until the age of 22, till their 22nd birthday. That is a huge win for children with disabilities. It's really wonderful. What I would say about it is this. The first thing is there is a definition of the class. Okay, so who are the kids that are covered? It includes anyone that was over 21 and under 22 before the filing of the action. And I don't have the date of the filing. I'm still trying to get that, but that's obviously going to be important. But if they were over 21 or under 22 before the filing of the action, or if they turned 21 while the action was pending. So that case has been pending for quite some time now. So there's a population of children who are in this class, and the court has said essentially those children are entitled to compensatory educational services. So they're entitled to educational services to make up for what's been lost. It is not clear what those services are going to look like at this point. The court has essentially ordered the parties to work together to come up with a plan, to identify the class, to notify people. So that should happen. But so for anybody, let's say who aged out last year, you know, they should be keeping an eye out for developments with regard to the compensatory education piece of this. For kids who, you know, turned 21 this school year and they just finished, My view, and again, there's no real clarity on this. The State Department of Education has not yet put out guidance. They had previously put out some guidance with regard to exiting, which we'll talk about. But clearly this changes at least part of that guidance. But my view is if you have a child that aged out, say on June 10th when school ended, I would be going back to the school and saying, hello, I'm sorry, you told me my child aged out, but here's this court decision that says they don't, and I'd like services to continue until my child turns 22. Now, the school may say, oh no, that's we gave you a diploma, you graduated, or some other way of saying no. And so my view is right now the best thing to do is parents should be making those requests. And if the school district says anything other than yes, of course we'll do that, then they really should be contacting an attorney and, you know, trying to assert those rights. Particularly, you know, if someone's turning 22 in July, maybe it's not, parent might, you know, decide they don't want to fight that. But if your child turned 21 in May, you're talking really about another year of services to get to that 22nd birthday. So, you know, I think it's something that, again, parents should be going in and saying, I'm sorry, you told me that my child could not continue with services, but now there's this decision that says my child is entitled to continue. And they were exited because they aged out, right? They didn't, you know, graduate at 19 because they finished everything and they met all their goals. That's kind of a different scenario. We're talking about kids who age out. And if that's the reason they were exited, then, you know, this decision would apply and people should be going back to the school district. Okay, so let's talk for a moment. Let me just check the time here. All right. I want to just talk for a moment about lost services due to COVID. So there is not a lot of clarity on that. And I'm sort of talking in particular, mostly we're going to talk about kids who are transitioning, right? Kids who are near the end of their program, were supposed to finish this year, right? And then they lost the last 3 months. So there is not a lot of clarity. So I'm going to tell you what we know, and then we'll kind of go from there. So the first thing is we know that the federal government has made clear that the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, both laws that prohibit discrimination against people based on disability, those laws still apply. There is no waiver. They are not allowed to discriminate. So discrimination is still prohibited, right? Number two, the federal government, you know, this U.S. Department of Education has made clear that FAPE, Free Appropriate Public Education, which is what's required under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, right? Our law that creates special education. FAPE is still required, has been required this whole time. So the United States Department of Education came out quite early, I think it was on March 12th, and it wrote a question and answer. And in that document, they made clear that children are still entitled to a free, appropriate public education. The State Department of Education put out guidance saying districts have to implement the IEP to the greatest extent possible. I think there have been some things stated by the State Department of Education that cause concern about the ability to pursue compensatory education services, right? If you've lost education due to the school's failure to provide FAPE, then typically you then have, you can try to get compensatory educational services to make up for what's been lost. So there's some things that have been put out by the State Department of Education that, you know, cause people to question how that's going to go. My view is that the federal law is pretty clear, and if you've lost services, then you may be entitled to compensatory education. So what the State Department of Ed has said, let me back up. So they recently put out what do we do about kids who are exiting? And basically what they said is if the child was supposed to exit, I'm not talking about age out right now. I'm talking we had a PPT, the child was turning 20, we made a decision that the child was going to graduate in June because they had achieved goals and objectives, and we think they're ready to graduate, right? So you have, say, that meeting in January, and then March rolls around and all the services now fall apart, right? Your services were vocational, community participation, all the things that now, or behavioral supports, right, that can't be delivered in home. So you've lost your last 3 months of services after you made a decision that there was going to be a graduation in June. So for situations like that, the State Department of Ed has essentially said the district should hold a PPT. They haven't put out any mandates, which would be nice to say, look, you just have to provide those 3 months, right? They haven't done that. They've said, districts, you have to hold a PPT meeting. And so, you know, we're kind of past the end of the school year now. So my view is, if you were in that situation and the district didn't hold a PPT, then you should probably go back and say, hey, wait a minute, you didn't do what you were supposed to do. And again, that could get complicated because they're going to argue that you graduated, right? Your student graduated. Once you graduate with a diploma, you're no longer eligible. But I think if the services are significant and something meaningful has been lost, parents should be going in and saying, hey, wait a minute, I have this thing from the State Department of Education. It says you should have held a PPT and you never did. So that's for kids who, as I said, were sort of not aging out, but a decision was made to graduate, and then the pandemic happened, and, you know, it just blew up your services, right? For kids who are aging out, the State Department of Ed has basically said the same thing. They should hold a meeting. They should consider if the student lost services, and if they lost services and they need those services as determined by the PPT, then those services should be provided. The State Department of Education also put in a caveat that said that for those kids, if there is a decision to provide additional services, their eligibility is not extended, which is language I find troubling, because if your eligibility isn't extended, then does that mean you're not entitled to FAPE as part of that program? Does that mean that if they don't deliver something that they promise, that you don't have recourse? That doesn't make any sense to me. So those are issues that are going to, and you know, at some point they may get litigated or as people raise issues. Right now, I think what people need to know again is, if your child aged out, you should be going back to the school, both saying, hey, wait a minute, you're supposed to have a PPT to talk about these services that I lost. And by the way, now I'm supposed to be continuing until the age of 22. So I think those things are really important. I'm going to stop here because we're at 3:30, and I want to make sure that if people have questions that we're able to talk about those. I think we've kind of gone over the general pieces of things. And so if there, and I know I've left a lot out because I'm sort of trying to do the major bullet points here, but if there's anything that people have questions about, I'd be happy to answer questions.
Hard to do transition in 30 minutes. It's not possible.
Yeah.
So one question early on, and I've put, again, all the links to the documents that Christina was talking about are in the chat or in the comments if you're watching on Facebook Live. So Phyllis had written a question in the chat. When you were talking about transition evaluations, she said, my child is in 11th grade. Do I ask for a transition evaluation?
So if you have a student, and so what I'm going to say, because I can't help it, I'm a lawyer, I have to, is I can't really give specific individual advice, right? It's not really appropriate to do that if I haven't actually reviewed records. However, from a general kind of framework perspective, a child in 11th grade should have had a transition evaluation already. If they have not, that is troubling to me, and absolutely you would want to request that. It's possible, depending on when the last evaluation was, that a parent may be able to just go in and say, I don't agree with the last evaluation. It was not sufficiently comprehensive, and I want an independent educational evaluation, specifically a transition evaluation. For that assessment, you really need to look at when were the evaluations, what was conducted. You know, there's a lot that goes into making a decision of whether you ask for a new evaluation or you ask for an independent evaluation. But absolutely, for a student in 11th grade, there should be a transition assessment. If you look at the IEP, and I'm not remembering which page it's on, I'm trying to imagine the IEP in my head, but I don't remember which page it's on. But there is a page in your IEP after your goals and objectives, or maybe it's before. I can't remember right now, but that says transition assessment has been completed and kind of lists them. And very, very often
it's page 6, the transition.
Thank you. I was like, I can't remember
That's
what
okay.
page it's on.
Yeah, I know you know that. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just
But very
COVID brain.
often, that's right. It's been, you know, I haven't had a normal, none of us have had a normal life for 4 months now. So, but if you look at that page, often it will say, yes, we did a transition evaluation. We interviewed the child. We did a COPS, you know, assessment, and the parent has no idea that's happened. And so I have gone into PPTs and said, or, you know, written a letter and said, hey, it says here you did a transition evaluation on this date. I'm entitled to an independent educational evaluation based on your transition evaluation, and I want my independent transition evaluation. So it's important to look at the document and see what it says about transition. How did they write the post-secondary, the post-school outcome goals? What does it say about post-secondary education? What does it say about employment? Look at that page in your IEP. You might be surprised to find what's there, and it may be things you've never discussed in a PPT meeting. So yeah, the sort of bottom line answer to should my child be evaluated if my child's in 11th grade is absolutely, yes.
And we have the transition series of webinars on our Facebook page, and one of them, I think the first one we did was transition in the IEP, and we really pick through that page and how the IEP is supposed to work together and what to look for. And so we may do, that one's a little long, so we might do some shorter ones, but if you really want to dig into the IEP document as it's connected with transition. So I just had to plug our Facebook. I can put the links in chat. So another question that was on Facebook, and I'm not sure, I'm going to ask for some clarity around Giant Steps that closed. And yeah, tough, not good. So I'm just going to clarify whether that's an actual transition age student or what. But let's say for the sake of saying that it is a transition age student, that the school closed. So what would you say to that family around services for transition right now?
So I think, if you had a child, and I won't make it specific to Giant Steps, right? You have a child who was placed in an educational program, the pandemic hit, and that program stopped providing services, right? They went out of business, or they said, we can't do remote, and they stopped providing services. My view is your school district, your local educational agency has an obligation to provide you with a different program. They have an obligation to implement that IEP. And if the program closed, then they're going to have to come up with somewhere else. And so now we're at the end of the school year. I don't know if that was a student who would have aged out, but I would say, number one, you go back and ask for a PPT to determine an appropriate placement. You ask for compensatory educational services because that student has lost educational services, and you ask for services to continue until the age of 21 if that was a student that was aging out due to turning 21 during the school year. That may become complicated, but I absolutely think if you've lost services, parents need to be pushing that issue and saying, wait a minute, my child did not get the services outlined in their IEP. And some of these are going to be complicated because the rule has been implement the IEP to the greatest extent possible. And so, people, lawyers who represent school districts, and school districts who are going to have limited funding are going to make arguments and say, look, we did that. We did that and you can't come after us. But I think you really, parents, we have to put the kids first and we have to be pushing those issues.
Okay. So another question, is the transition evaluation typically done by the school?
So in short, yes. So whenever an evaluation is done in the context of special education, typically the school does the evaluation, right? That's kind of the process. There's an evaluation, the team decide, right? The PPT team decides an evaluation should occur, and typically the school district does that evaluation. So yes, typically the evaluation is done by the district. Again, you have the right, if you disagree with that evaluation, and disagreement can be based on it's not sufficiently comprehensive, I don't agree with the outcome. All you have to do is disagree with the evaluation. If you disagree with the evaluation, you can ask for an independent educational evaluation. And then, if the district says yes, you can select a qualified evaluator and go get your own assessment of transition and transition skills.
Okay, great. And then another question, how and where do I find the transitional services that target my child's needs? He turned 19, now is in the Farmington Transition Program, works 5 days a week. How do I know which transition program fits my child?
That's a tougher question. I think the first piece of that is knowing exactly what your child needs, and that goes back to the evaluation. So the first thing is make sure you have a good evaluation so you know exactly what services you're looking for. From there, you kind of have to do a lot of legwork from my perspective. You have to get on the phone, start calling programs, asking other parents where their kids have gone, connecting with groups like CPAC and others. There's lots of organizations, connecting with other parents, connecting with the Special Education Parent Teacher Association, talking to other parents and finding out where their kids have gone and what the quality of service has been. There are educational advocates who help parents find placements. So that's another resource. Attorneys like me, there's many other attorneys that do what I do. We sometimes help parents find placements. We'll give them a list and say, just call and see. My thinking is make a list of all the components of your ideal program, and then make a spreadsheet and go out to the programs, visit them in person. A little hard to do with the pandemic, but certainly in normal times, that's an absolute from my perspective. Go out, visit the program, ask your questions, make your spreadsheet so you can compare them later. You kind of have to feel the program. I mean, maybe that sounds a little silly, but I really believe that. I think parents need to go on the campus and see what it's like and how it feels, and is that going to be a good fit for my child? So hopefully that answers your question. There is a list of state approved special education placements. It's on the State Department of Education website.
I'm going to put the pathway, how to get there. I'll put that in the comments because it's a little complex to find it.
Right. And the other thing is, it doesn't necessarily, there are lots of schools that offer programs that are not on that list.
Yes.
There's a little bit more complexity maybe to getting those placements paid for by your district, but step one is find the placement. Find the placement that fits your child's needs and like personality, because that's going to be the thing that sets your child up for success.
Great. I'm just copying the pathway here. Yeah. And so also this information is contained in one of our webinars, the Transition and the Law. I talk about the how to find the programs that may be appropriate for your child, and how to determine that, how to walk through the IEP and figure out and determine what the needs are of that particular student.
Right.
That worked.
And that's why I think the evaluation is so important. If you have a really good evaluation and you know we need a certain kind of vocational component, we need a behaviorist, we need, you can make a list and then literally make a spreadsheet and bring it with you to your visits and start asking questions. Do you have a board certified behavior analyst? Is that person here full time? How many students does that person serve? You make all your list of questions before you go to the program. And that I think is very helpful in terms of selecting programs and really figuring out which one's a good fit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So does anybody else on the call, you're welcome to unmute yourself. Carol, if you have a question, you want to unmute yourself? Or I can do it. There you go.
Yeah.
You got it.
Thank you so much.
Hi, by the way, how are you?
Yeah, I'm fine. I didn't see the note that I was supposed to email my question in advance. I'm a volunteer helper of families, and a parent had a final PPT for her son on June 3rd, and by June 8th realized it was a terrible mistake and wants to decline the diploma and insist on transition services because the district said they didn't have anything. So she said, well, I guess if they don't have anything, he should graduate. And I said, well, that's not correct. They do have things. And anyway, so now she's worried that the district is stalling to wait until her son turns 18 and therefore could, they could dangle the diploma in front of him and he'd go, yeah, that's what I want. Because no one has bothered to talk to him about how his transition services don't have to be in the high school,
Right.
special education classroom. Short of becoming his conservator in a very short amount of time, does she have any recourse?
Well, I mean, has the student actually received the diploma?
No
Okay.
diploma.
Okay. So, I think number one, yes, but she better move quickly.
Yeah.
That refusal of the diploma, you want that to happen before whatever the graduation date is, because once that graduation date,
she did it via email, and the pupils director has said, well, I'll try to set up a PPT, before the end of June. But
okay. So that, it sounds like she at least got in under the wire. There's not a diploma that's been issued.
No.
With regard to the student that's 18, I certainly have had that experience, right? Where we're in a PPT and they bring in the student and the student's like, yeah, I'm great. Of course I'm ready for college. And everybody, the parents are looking at the child saying, or the adult at that point saying, absolutely not. I think there are a few things that can be done. One of the things that I usually do is I set up a meeting with the parent and that student, and I say, come on normal times, come to my office and let's have a conversation, because I think kids at that age, number one, they want to do what everybody else is doing. They want to graduate, right? Number two, if you tell them they're not graduating, they hear, I'm going to go back to high school next year. And so I do think that meeting is really important to say, hey, there are lots of options here of how we could create a program that you might like and that's going to do things you need. But you really kind of have to be able to have that kind of conversation with that, now 18-year-old or soon to be 18-year-old. And I will often say, your mom and dad want you to continue. They think you need some additional skills, but, I know it's not going to be successful if you are not invested in it. And so let's talk about what you want and what you'll agree to. And sometimes I'm sometimes surprised where they say, oh, you mean it's not in the high school? Oh, I can go out and get a job and I can learn how to, then they sort of buy into it. So I think that's very important to have that conversation prior to the PPT. I also will sometimes see if the child will agree to sign, just the State Department of Ed has a sample document, but just the document that says, I'm 18, but I'm going to allow my parent to make just educational decisions for me.
Where's that document?
Well, the district should have one on its website. If the district doesn't have one on its website, I've created one myself.
Yeah.
I feel like there was
I
a
have a
sample one on the
formal
state's premise.
document.
You have one.
The state actually adopted the one CPAC created
Okay, perfect.
because Pat Anderson, who was the transition
Yes.
coordinator previously, had given the statement. So I can, I believe I can post that.
Would it be on the CPAC website?
You know, I'll have to look and make sure that I got it
Right.
up there on the CPAC
Can
website.
I ask you a
It's
question?
called Age of Majority, but yeah, I'll find it and I'll make sure that
Right.
it becomes available to people and we post the link.
Jane, I'm gonna come back to you one second. I just want to finish a
Okay.
thought with regard to Carol. And then
Sure,
I'm gonna
sure,
come
I'm
to you.
sorry.
If
Yeah.
that's okay. But that form, so if the young adult fills out that form and says, I give my parent permission to go to the PPT meetings, sometimes you have a conversation with that person to say, we think it's a good idea for you not to be in the PPT meeting, because if the attorney for the district is there, or, you know, the special ed director, they can manipulate kids.
Yes.
And it, you know, it's not a good situation, right? Because then they're in there saying, yeah, I'm ready to go. And that's not what's in their best interest. So that's the other piece, is they can, you know, if the you know, child will voluntarily say, of course you can make the educational decisions for me, they can sign that piece of paper. You know, they don't have to go through a power of attorney or trying to get conservatorship. Conservatorship is a challenge to get, right? If the individual's intellectually disabled, you may be able to get guardianship. Conservatorship, you do have to show that the person cannot make decisions for themselves. Not that they're not making good decisions, because you're allowed to make bad decisions, but that you're not capable of making decisions and taking care of yourself. So that's a more challenging thing, at least to do on an involuntary basis. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Jane, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a unique situation. My son is 19. He was diagnosed 2016 when he was in 9th grade as Eisenberg syndrome back then.
Mm-hmm.
And he did have an IEP, but never offered the services. So when he approached a social worker, he was told to just walk away from the problem. So he was basically kicked out of the school, placed outside the school by the 11th grade. And he was re-diagnosed by a piece of puzzle as autism spectrum. And he was placed in the Farmington Valley Transition Program. And over there, so he's academic, actually very good at math and science and English. He doesn't like to read, know how to write. So his cognitive skill, since he was placed in the other school, alternative school, has declining. So trying to bring him up skill, but he was placed in the Farmington Transition Program where he was sent to work 5 days a week, you know, and he really wanted to take college courses. So I'm wondering, because he really into the psychology and the social services, so he can help other people like him, he said, who were suffering from high school bullied and so on and so forth.
Right.
So I'm in the transition of, I don't know, he's almost turning to 20. Where do I find the services? And that's my question. I know you gave me some website. Is any advocate and that can help me out find those services?
Right. So so I want to be careful just to not get too far into sort of individual circumstances, again, because I haven't looked at your records and there's
so
some
are you
complexities there, but
I'm sorry. What's your role? I did not quite get your role.
I'm an attorney, so I represent
you're an attorney.
Parents, right?
Okay.
So I represent parents who have children who have special education needs for the purpose of trying to obtain what they need.
Okay.
What I would say is this, sort of as a general proposition, if a student is regressing, then that's not good. That's not what we look for, right? That is the opposite of what we want to happen. And so if a student is regressing, then in general, you want to go back and address that at a PPT and say the services aren't appropriate. It is always helpful to have good evaluations. Again, if you've had a recent evaluation, you may be able to ask for an IEE. But you want to have a good evaluation to figure out, why is that child regressing? what services are needed to get the child back on track, and what do we do going forward. So I think those are some things to think about. In terms of finding a program, I'm not going to recommend a specific educational advocate, but there certainly are many educational advocates in the state. If you Google educational advocate special education, you will get a list in your area. Some of them are fantastic. There isn't necessarily a particular college degree or certificate, so just make sure you get their background, make sure they're experienced, find out what their qualifications are, find out how long they've been doing it. If you're going to use an advocate, there are also attorneys. I'm one of them, but there are attorneys throughout the state that also do this. And so again, you could Google special education attorney Connecticut.
Okay, just
and
one,
you'll
I'm
get a
sorry.
list.
Yeah, just go back. I'm not trying to cut you off, try to not to forget. You mentioned the transition only services. Sounds like the 5-minute transition program only send them out to work and get the bus home.
Right.
And it's really not satisfied the need of my child. And he want to take college courses. He was told he was not ready. Doesn't seem to be a good fit, but and you mentioned the transition only services would be possible. Can you explain a little bit about those?
So transition only services would be services for a student who's met all of the academic requirements, right? They go through their 4 years of high school, they've met the academic requirements, but they need those independent living and, pre-employment, post, skills to be ready for post-secondary education. So they get an IEP, and it's possible that that's what you have. I can't say without looking at it, but an IEP that's focused on more of the functional skills, right? And that would be a transition services only IEP. What I would say about the comment about like my child wants to go to college and my child's been placed in a program where they're sending my child to a work site, going back to kind of the beginning, the way this is supposed to work is we do an evaluation, we identify the students' post-school outcome goals, and then we develop a plan based on those goals. And so if the goal is, I want to go to college, the plan, the educational program, the goals and objectives, the services that are provided, and the placement should be in service of that post-school outcome goal. So I don't want to go any deeper into like individual case. Again, I'm trying to keep it from a framework perspective and the legal perspective. But the program should be designed to help the child transition to what they want to transition to, which would be, independent living. What is their college goal? What is their employment goal? And if it's not, then you go back to the drawing board. You say, give me a PPT meeting. We need to talk about this.
So I just want to be really conscious of the time because thank you, Christina. I appreciate that you've taken the time to talk with us today. I did put a couple of links into the chat box. One is for COPA, which is the Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates, where you can search by state to find people in Connecticut that could perhaps support that. But I also put the online learning link for CPAC in the chat box as well, because a lot of the questions that have been asked have been answered in those webinars, the transition to adult life webinars. So, take a look at those. And thank you, Christina. We really appreciate it. If you have more questions, please reach out to CPAC. We can help guide you. We have some attorneys and advocates that we actually do talk with and ask questions, and Christina is one of them. She's very generous with her time and working with us. And we're taking a little hiatus next week, just so everyone is aware. We won't have our regular Tuesday, Thursday, 3 o'clock calls. However, we do have our Spanish calls that are all still happening next week on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 1 and 4. Wednesday at 4, right? Please, staff, help me. I don't always remember. They're shaking their heads, yes. So yeah, so thank you all very much. And we hope to see you back again on the 30th. We'll be talking about, is that, Lisa, is that a chat or is that, you're muted, honey?
Sorry, you're muted.
I really need a little sign.
Sorry, I had spoken to Robert in a private chat, so he had sent it to me accidentally, but I think he meant to send it to the full group. And it was, can Attorney Ghio confirm the appeal deadline for a fully educated due process hearing?
Yeah, adjudicated due
Sorry.
process hearing. Yeah, that's
It said to, according to Title 20 U.S. States Code 1415, I believe it's 90 days. That was the most recent question.
You know, I never do appeal deadlines from memory. I would want to just look at my regulation and confirm the deadline. I can certainly get an answer out to you, but I don't want to say what the number is that's in my head, because every time I have to do anything that requires a deadline, I go back and I check it again just to make sure I've got it right.
So Robert, if you want to email that question
Yeah,
to
I can get it to you.
at cpacinc.org, and I can connect with Christina, and we can get that answer to your question. So thank you, everyone. We're going to sign off for now. I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and take care and enjoy the beautiful weather. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you all.
Christina, you were great. Thank you for all that information.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.